Mirai was designed to target Linux-based smart devices such as routers, IP cameras, and DVRs by scanning the internet for systems exposed over Telnet using a hard-coded list of around 60 default username and password combinations, which allowed it to automatically brute force login credentials and gain access without exploiting complex software vulnerabilities. Once inside a device, Mirai would install itself in memory rather than on disk, which made it harder to detect and meant it would only persist until the device rebooted, which then allowed it to be reinfected again if the device was still exposed. Infected devices were then connected to servers, which coordinated large-scale DDoS attacks using multiple techniques including TCP, SYN floods, UDP floods, and HTTP request floods, which generated massive volumes of traffic from thousands of devices all at once. In one of its most well-known incidents, Mirai was used in an attack against DIN, a DNS provider, which reached traffic levels exceeding 1 terabit per second, and disrupted domain resolution for platforms like Twitter, Netflix, GitHub, and Reddit across parts of North America and Europe. Shortly after this, the original authors released Mirai's source code on a hacking forum, which allowed others to create modified versions that changed credential lists, attack methods, and spreading behavior, which increased the scale and frequency of similar botnet attacks. Gafgyt, also known as Bashlight, was designed to target Linux-based smart devices such as routers and cameras by scanning for systems exposed over Telnet once again, and attempting to log in using lists of common and default credentials, which allowed it to gain access without relying on complex software exploits. Once inside a device, Gafgyt would download and execute its binary, which then connected the device to remote servers that issued commands for coordinated attacks. Like Mirai, infected devices were used to launch large-scale DDoS attacks, primarily using UDP floods, TCP floods, and HTTP-based requests, which allowed attackers to generate significant traffic from a distributed network of compromised devices. Gafgyt also included basic remote control features, which allowed operators to execute shell commands on infected systems, update the malware, or direct attacks in real time. Unlike Mirai's automated scanning approach, some variants of Gafgyt relied more heavily on manual distribution or scripts to spread, which made its growth slower but still very effective. And over time, multiple versions of Gafgyt appeared, also each modifying attack methods, target devices, and credential lists, which allowed it to remain active even as awareness of botnet threats increased and basic security practices improved. XorDDoS was designed to target Linux servers rather than consumer smart devices, focusing on systems with weak SSH credentials by scanning for open ports and attempting password-based logins, which allowed it to gain access without relying on software exploits. Once inside, XorDDoS would install a persistent backdoor and modify system startup scripts like rc.local or cron jobs, which allowed it to remain active even after reboots and give attackers long-term control over the machine. It typically ran as a compiled ELF binary and in some cases used obfuscation to avoid detection, which made analysis much more difficult. Infected systems were then connected to servers that coordinated large-scale DDoS attacks using, again, the same techniques, which generated sustained traffic from high-bandwidth servers instead of low-power devices. The malware also used XOR-based encryption to hide its communication with control servers, which is where its name comes from, and made network activity harder to detect. Over time, different variants appeared that updated encryption methods, persistent techniques, and targeting strategies, which allowed it to continue spreading across poorly secured Linux servers. Tsunami, also known as Kaiji, was a Linux-based backdoor that targeted servers by using weak or stolen SSH credentials to gain access, which allowed attackers to take control also without exploiting software vulnerabilities. Once inside, Tsunami malware would run as a compiled binary and would often rename itself to blend in with normal system processes, which made it less noticeable during basic monitoring. It would then connect to an IRC server, typically over common ports like 6667, and join a specific channel where it waited for commands, which allowed attackers to control large numbers of infected machines in real time. These infected systems were mainly used to launch DDoS attacks using methods like TCP SYN floods, but also ACK floods and UDP floods, which generated sustained traffic from high bandwidth servers. The malware also supported remote command execution, which allowed attackers to run shell commands, update the malware, or use the system for additional tasks. Unlike more automated botnets, Tsunami was often deployed after an initial manual compromise or alongside other malware, which made its spread slower but meant that it was more targeted. Over time, multiple variants also appeared that would adjust how it connected to IRC servers and handled commands, which allowed it to remain in use even as the older IRC-based control methods became easier to detect. RansomEXX, also known as Defray777 in its earliest form, was a Linux targeting ransomware strain that focused on high-value enterprise systems rather rather than widespread automated infections, typically gaining access through compromised credentials or previously breached networks, which allowed attackers to deploy it manually after already obtaining broad access to a company's systems. Once inside, RansomEXX would execute as a compiled ELF binary and begin encrypting files across the system using very strong encryption, appending new file extensions and making data inaccessible without a decryption key. It specifically targeted enterprise infrastructure, including ESXi hypervisors, where it encrypted virtual machine disk files, which allowed a single attack to take down multiple servers at once. The malware also terminated running services and virtual machines before the encryption, which ensured files were not locked and could be fully processed. It avoided unnecessary system damage, at least, which allowed the machine to remain operational while critical data was still locked, which increased the likelihood of payment. Unlike botnet malware, it did not spread automatically and instead relied on attackers moving through a network before deploying it. Victims were then presented with ransom notes demanding payment, usually in cryptocurrency on the dark web, in exchange for a decryption tool. Erebus, or Erebus, was a Linux targeting ransomware strain that focused heavily on web hosting servers, often gaining access through compromised or poorly secured web services, which allowed attackers to deploy it directly onto systems storing large amounts of website data. Once inside, Erebus would execute as a compiled ELF binary and begin encrypting files using a combination of AES and RSA encryption, which made recovery without a key extremely difficult. It specifically targeted web data, configuration files, and databases, which caused entire websites to become inaccessible. The malware kept systems running while encrypting critical data, which increased pressure on victims to actually pay. One of the most notable incidents involved the South Korean hosting provider Nayana, where Erebus infected around 153 Linux servers and encrypted data for over 3,000 websites, causing a widespread outage across hosted domains. Victims were presented with ransom notes demanding payment in cryptocurrency in exchange for a decryption key for all of those websites. And similar to RansomEXX, Erebus relied on direct deployment after attackers had already gained access, which made its attacks more targeted and damaging in shared hosting environments. HiddenWasp was a Linux targeting malware family that focused on maintaining long-term access to compromised servers rather than spreading quickly, typically being deployed after attackers had already gained root-level access, which allowed it to operate with full control over the system. Once installed, HiddenWasp deployed a combination of a rootkit, Trojan, and remote control tool, which worked together to hide its presence while still allowing attackers to execute commands on the system. It modified system binaries and used LD_preload techniques to intercept system calls, which allowed it to hide processes, files, and network connections from standard monitoring tools. The malware communicated with remote servers to receive commands and upload data, which enabled persistent control and potential data exfiltration. It was typically delivered as a compiled ELF binary also, and often disguised itself as legitimate system files, which made detection much more difficult. Unlike other botnets or ransomware, HiddenWasp did not focus on DDoS or encryption, and instead was all about stealth and persistence, which made it more useful for maintaining ongoing access to compromised infrastructure. Its components were often based on publicly available tools, which allowed attackers to customize the deployments while still blending in with normal Linux activity. Kaiji was a Linux targeting botnet malware that focused on infecting servers and powerful devices by brute forcing SSH credentials using lists of common usernames and password combinations, which allowed it to compromise systems without relying on software exploits. Very similar to all earlier ones. Once inside, Kaiji malware would download and run as a compiled binary, which then connected the system to, again, remote servers that issued commands for coordinated activity. It was written in the Go programming language, which allowed it to run efficiently across different Linux systems and handle multiple tasks like scanning and attacks all at the same time. Infected machines were in fact used to launch large-scale DDoS attacks, particularly HTTP floods, which would also generate high traffic from all of those servers. Kaiji also included behavior to terminate competing malware processes on the system, which allowed it to take full control of the device's resources. It continued scanning for new targets over SSH and deployed itself using simple scripts, which allowed it to spread across poorly secured servers. Over time, variants appeared that adjusted attack methods and propagation techniques, which allowed it to remain active as Linux-focused botnets evolved. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.